All right, so to start my presentation, just to provide a little bit more information about me, even though it's the end of the event. My name is Dielle, and I use she, her, or ze, here pronouns. And I live in Seattle, Washington, on the unceded lands of the Duwamish, Puyallup, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot tribes. I'm a white trans feminine person, and I'm disabled and neurodivergent. My kind of primary affiliation is with Boston University School of Public Health, where I am primarily focused on the health impacts of structural determinants and how things like structural ableism get embodied into people's health. But I have also been active in this area of textile waste for a while and was involved in co-founding both Make Fashion Clean and the Aftermath Learning Lab, which are projects that emerged in large part out of relationships with Dr. Julia Devoy and Matilda Larty, who we've gotten to hear from both today. And the three of us have been connected in discussing these issues for, I think it was since 2013 now. So we're either close to a decade or after a decade. But I just wanted to acknowledge that I think this conference for us is really aligned with the mission that our collaboration has been focused on, which is really trying to bring together different perspectives and different people working in different areas to try to tackle the same problem with different skill sets, because oftentimes people working on the same thing in different areas or different fields can become very siloed. And so I'm really excited that LEAPS this year was able to capture so many different perspectives and people working on different areas, whether it be like education, engineering, waste management, or design. There were a lot of different areas that came up today. So kind of the inspiration for this conference was really the focus on policy. And we heard quite a bit about different policies or areas that are relevant to policy as we went along today. But I wanted to add some specific comments about a few specific areas. And so today I'm going to touch on the scale of textile consumption in the United States, some policies, and just some reflections on policy needed to address consumption of new textiles in the US. And then the second part, I'll be talking a bit about the scale of pollution from textile waste generated in the US and its impacts, and some related policies that have been discussed recently and will be important for us to continue looking at collectively. And so when I think about trying to address textile pollution, I really kind of divided into these two parts, like I have in the presentation area, which is how do we address consumption and generation? And then secondly, like conditional on there's going to be some waste generation, how are we making sure, or how are different parties making sure that that textile waste is not creating health impacts in particular. So I'm going to just start by touching briefly on the scale of textile consumption in the US, which is a theme that came up frequently today. That's an underlying driver of all this is just the rapid growth in textiles. And this is not a super like detailed analysis. It's just kind of an informal analysis by market line, but it quantifies the size of the global apparel industry by year from 2011 to 2020. And we can see that there's been this huge growth in the global apparel industry. And when we look at the US, we see a similar growth going from $120 billion of sales in 1992 to in 2022, that had risen to $312 billion of sales. And interestingly, in this graph, you can see in 2020, there's this big diff for the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, but then sales immediately rebounded. And then on the right is a figure that was also referenced a lot today, which is the rate of waste generation in the United States. This is data from the EPA, and we can see rapidly growing waste generation, which the dark blue part is the amount that is being recycled, and that is relatively small in relation to the trend overall. And then just one prior study that I think Jackie might have mentioned is a study that our lab worked on a few years ago now, but we looked at differences in waste generation and showed that the areas in the United States that are driving the most waste are high median income, counties with high median incomes. And so moving into kind of the policy discussion of this, I just wanted to offer a few reflections that occurred to me in thinking about some of the presentations here at the conference, just as a means to kind of pull some things together. And so something I've been saying for a while, just kind of in my own conversations about this topic with friends and colleagues is like, we cannot recycle our way out of this problem. And here I added the word only, which I think is a better way of saying this. We can't only recycle our way out of this problem. And I think effective recycling is a very important piece of this. And we saw some really promising kind of strategies and approaches to that today. And then similarly, we also saw this huge talk about consumption and how we need to reduce generation. And so I think it's important that we maintain some amount of, I don't know if skepticism is even the right word, but curiosity to make sure that recycling initiatives do not enable the status quo, because the rate of growth and generation is not something that we can solve through recycling alone. I think we really need to change how fashion is produced. And I think that was touched on in pretty much every presentation today, was just how much the values of the industry need to change. So we need to reduce textile consumption, and then we also relatedly need to increase the quality and durability of textiles, which will reduce the amount of consumption if textiles are lasting longer. And so these changes are really needed, and they need to accompany recycling, but we cannot only focus on recycling. At least that's kind of the theme I emerged with today. And then similarly, I think as we think about reducing consumption and reducing textile waste generation, a theme we heard a lot today was education. And I think education is important because you can, an interesting example, because you can think about education at the individual level, or you can think about the ways that like organizations and communities support larger patterns of awareness about sustainability, which was something that came up many times today across many different contexts. And so I think it's really important, as a number of folks talked about today, to think about who is driving this growth in consumption, and what about the environment, and what about our marketing, and what about, or like the marketing and the fashion industry is driving this demand for excess clothing. And I think individual change is important, but we really need to tackle this at a higher level, at more of a systems level, is one of the things that I emerged from today. And so, that all of those ideas could be translated into a lot of different policy suggestions, but just a few things that I've been thinking about, and that also were touched on in various ways today, is really transparency was emphasized a number of times. And I think a big thing that we do not have transparency on right now is the amount of fashion being produced, the production volumes, the amount of key materials. And I think that more than any other item is the most critical thing for us to know the impact of a company is, like how much. And we don't know that. And it's not something that is necessarily always reported. And so I think that transparency for large fashion corporations is something that can be tackled from a policy angle, and is an area for continued discussion and advocacy. Kind of relatedly is financial accountability for the cost of recycling. And so this is something that's been discussed a lot recently in regards to extended producer responsibility legislation. The MFI Foundation in Ghana has a very detailed proposal around globally accountable extended producer responsibility that would make sure to distribute some of the, or a lot of the funds that companies would have to pay for the cost of recycling, and making sure that they're going to stakeholders around the world who are really doing a lot of the actual recycling because of where textiles are being shipped. And then another topic that came up today was greenwashing. And I think this relates to transparency, but policies that really can regulate the marketing of clothing, because I think with education, we're seeing increases in awareness of that there are fashion consequences, or there are health consequences, environmental consequences, social consequences to textile pollution. And greenwashing is in many ways a response by large corporations to that, to try to assure customers that, you know, we've made these small changes and so now it's okay. And I think if we can fight that, that can really help amplify other efforts related to education in terms of their impact. All right, so kind of transitioning into the second part of moving from consumption to like conditional on the idea that there's going to be some waste, what can be done to reduce its impacts, which was a topic that was explored also many times today. So I just wanted to show a little bit of data from a working paper that we did in the lab. It hasn't been published yet, but we used this terminology of the global north and global south in this paper, and recognize that there's enormous limitations to it. But the reason that we use that is kind of from this conceptualization of waste colonialism, and that a lot of waste is moving from the global north to the global south. And then kind of a more technical reason is we were interested in looking at like where are used clothes from the US, where are they ending up in terms of like what we can see in publicly available trade data. And it's difficult to do that from a single country like the US, because there's many clothes often pass through multiple countries along their route. So that was sort of our reason for taking this approach. But in this international trade data that includes a lot of almost all of the data on trade that is reported, we found that 78 billion pounds of used textiles were shifted from the global north to the global south over the period of 2000 to 2019. And then importantly, that there was a huge increase over that period. So there was a 234% increase from 2000 to 2019. And so these are kind of rough exploratory analyses, but I think they really highlight the scale of this. And again, something that we've touched on multiple times today is just the growth, that this is not slowing down, it is becoming bigger. And so we see that most of the clothing is originating in Europe and North America, and also a large portion in Asia. And so then this is looking at the specific countries that are sending used textiles to the global south. And so the United States is the country that was sending most in this analysis. And again, we see this huge increase from 0.4 billion in 2000 to closer to 1.4 billion. And then finally, this data, you're able to look at some of the destinations. And in Africa, Ghana is one of the largest recipients, and in the Americas, these are the largest recipients that were shown: Guatemala, Chile, Honduras, Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua. And so just to like wrap up a few reflections on this point in this piece of reducing global impacts of textile pollution, which was something Matilda spoke to at length in her presentation. Something that I wanted to note is just textile waste import bans were being discussed by a number of countries, and particularly in East Africa, pre-pandemic, and I think those some have been implemented and some continue to be discussed, but I think a lot of discourse has increasingly focused on exactly kind of what Matilda was talking about, of considering scale and the quality of clothing. And I think that a really important consideration in that is equity, and who is making these policies, and who within there's the question of who in terms of policymakers in which country, but then also within countries whose voice is centered there, because there are a number of different stakeholders within this. So I think those questions will be continue to be discussed a lot in the years to come as larger policies related to this are discussed. Something going back to this idea of transparency is that we really need to also ask for transparency with recycling initiatives. Most recycling initiatives do not report the % of clothing that's shipped abroad, or the % of clothing that is just landfilled in the United States. And I think part of that is it's difficult to do that, because most, as we saw in the presentation, I think it was our second presentation today, when one organization or initiative does not take clothing, it goes to another one and another one. So it's this chain, and it can be very difficult to trace where exactly clothing is ended up. But I think that is a very important area for research and potential policy, because as people become more aware of these issues, they will want that information when deciding where to donate. And then finally, I think there's been a huge increase in the amount of research on the impacts of textile waste, whether those be environmental, social, health. And I think the challenge and the next step will be really to do that in context. And I think local stakeholders and communities are best positioned to do that. But I think it will be important to consider context, because I think textile waste could have very differential health impacts depending on the specific community, and aspects of where are people getting water, where is the textile waste located relative to the water source, and different things like that might vary by community will be very important to assess risk. So I think there's already a lot of conversation starting to happen around that, but I think those will continue and be very important to understanding the environmental and health impacts of this. And so similarly, just to kind of finish on some possible policies that are kind of being discussed right now or could be discussed soon is increasing transparency in textile recycling, investments in upcycling and community-generated solutions to textile waste, such as the redistributions of resources to communities affected by textile pollution, especially in the Global South, such as those proposed by the OR Foundation. And then finally, I think just policies, most of these policy areas that I shared so far have kind of all been like regulations and things where we want people to stop doing things. And I think it's very important to also think about the opposite and having state governments and grants and different policymakers really investing in the circular economy and in community-led level initiatives to reuse clothing and to organize community networks and to doing all of this upcycling and doing all of like the gathering of clothing and all of that takes a lot of time and resources. And so it's important, if it's a priority for it to happen, then there needs to be resources at a policy level devoted to it for it to really happen. And so I think continuing to see an increase in those will be very important and is something that we can continue to advocate for in really whatever area of this you are involved in. And so with that, I am going to wrap up, and just I wanted to thank everyone who has tuned in today for the conference. It is very exciting that we had so many presenters this year and a lot of people joining us. And I know from last year, we had far more people viewing the recordings than attended in person. So hopefully that people who presented today and the conversation that happened can continue even as we move ahead after the conference. And so with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Cecilia, who will just be giving a few wrap-up comments about ways to stay engaged after LEAPS.
Thanks, Dielle. Thank you, Dielle, for those final remarks. I'm now going to share a few minutes about staying engaged after the LEAPS conference. Our hope is that you leave our conference today inspired, thinking about new ideas, and then maybe with some new connections too. To help you remain engaged, we have compiled some resources for you. So here's the link to our Stay Engaged resources. It is aftermathlearninglab.com/lips-2024-resources. When you click into the link, you would see recordings from last year's conference, LEAPS 2023, details of the Aftermath sculpture and its documentary, a free 30-minute course about global textile pollution, publications by the Aftermath Learning Lab and collaborators, a recording of panel discussion between the board members of MFI and MFC with Mathilde Larte and Stacey Johnson. And here is how to stay connected with the lab and partners. You could see the website and Instagram account of Aftermath Learning Lab, Make Fashion Clean, MFC, and the MFI Foundation. There are some other sustainable fashion organizations to follow too, such as Fashion Revolution, the OR Foundation, and Slow Fact to see their websites or follow their Instagram accounts. And then the LEAPS conference is made possible in large part due to volunteer time from members of the Make Fashion Clean team. While we are committed to making the event free and publicly available, we encourage participants, especially those who generate a lot of textile waste, to consider donating to the MFC Textile Waste campaign that we will be launching on Monday, April 29th. All proceeds directly supports the MFC MFI Foundation Upcycling Partnership, an initiative of artisans who are upcycling textile waste in Ghana. As we said before, We plan to make recordings of the LIPS 2024 Textile Waste Conference available within 2 to 4 weeks after the conference, once we have time to edit the captions. Finally, thank you so much to our partners, the Aftermath Learning Lab, Make Fashion Clean, MFI Foundation, and Boston College Schiller Institute for Integrated Science and Society. And special thanks to Julia Devoy, Dielle Lundberg, Cecilia Chen, Alison Metzger, Jackie Alicia, Carrie Condell, Molly McGreen, Matilda Larte, and more. And finally, with that, thank you so much for attending LIPS 2024 Conference Textile Waste Conference. We hope to see you back at this event next year and to stay in touch. Thank you so much.